So, guys, I want to do another tough video, and I want to talk about boundaries. And boundaries are always something that we should really teach our, relatives, and our like children growing up. And I do have a couple of examples, and I do want to also talk about, a couple of personal stories that I remember that I had a bunch of siblings, and we would stay over at my grandmother's place. And what would happen is that one of my siblings watched Titanic, and they got the idea of being nude, just like the woman in that movie, really. So they had like a phase where they were just walking around with a big like blanket sheet and walking around nude, or walking around nude when nobody was looking. And one time, my grandmother caught them doing that, and she really wanted to talk to their parents about that. But this person kept pleading and pleading, like, don't tell them because they're saying like don't tell my parents because my parents will flip out. And then eventually my grandmother gave in, and it was a little unfortunate because I knew that this relative who did this, he always had like an issue of like really impulsive like behavior, really, or or as an adult he has a bit of like sex addiction. But this could have been something where if she could have sat this person down and be like, okay, this is how we're gonna deal with it. Or if you feel like your parents overreact, this is how I'm gonna deal with it, and we can just keep it to ourselves, really. But this is also one of the reasons why when we as parents, we have to think about overreactions and underreactions. And I would even say too, if I had a kid and I knew that they were like, streaking and other things like that, I would just like say, hey, we gotta talk about this. Like, first of all, why you're doing this? Where did you get the idea from? And then the next things that I would make them write, like at least 10 pages about, even if it's like a list about what was going through their brain, why did they make that, and we'll talk about it. And if I said, okay, you're at the age where, like what happens to a lot of children when they're prepubescent, when they're like 13, 14, is that they have a sexual awakening, and sometimes they do impulsive things like be nude or experiment more with their bodies, really. So, teaching them like sexual self-control, consequences of why we have those boundaries, and also why we don't do things like that, because easily, when we do anything that's inappropriate, like streaking or walking around naked, it's disturbing to other people. And then also, since you're underage, it puts people in a more disturbed like mindset, really. So that's an example of two things about complacency, but also this person, the story didn't go out to their parents, really, because it was almost like, they were afraid of the parental reaction, and I knew these parents were people that would throw furniture, scream, yell, blame it on disability, possibly take their kid, put them in a psychiatric ward, and medicate them. And then they may they may grow up to be like, sexually abstinent because of what happened to them, So yeah, sometimes we as parents also have to know how to like process things and how to respond to, challenging behavior that our children go through. The next thing is that I had, there was a relative that was like 3 or 4 years old in my family, and they had a lot of issues with boundaries as a kid. Like I remember like one time this relative, when this person was like 3 or 4 years old, they had an issue of like climbing on other relatives, and just be bouncing up and down on their pelvis. And I'm not sure if it's because that when that relative was a baby, that they may have watched their parents have sex or whatever, or maybe they think it's cute or whatever, but they were like always bouncing up and down on somebody's pelvis. I had a girlfriend, when I got out of college, and she was always doing the same type of, cowgirl type of position, really, and it was kind of very similar to that. But the thing about it is that if you have like a kid who's doing that, you gotta pull them off and be like, hey, don't do that, that's inappropriate, really. And sometimes people just ignored it. But it's like, as I said too, like imagine if, somebody had a daughter, and then the daughter was like bending over doing stretches. Like there are some stretches you do for track or ballet where you bend over, touch your toes. What would happen if there was like a kid that's a boy and it was like humping her from behind, really, because they're young and they thought that was cute or funny, really? How would we respond, really? But this relative was like a boy doing that to another boy, really. So it's a little weird how some people don't let that go, really. Like if it was my son, same thing. I'll pull them off and be like, hey, you never do that. That's very inappropriate. Because you know what, it's but it's private parts touching really. That's why we don't do things. And if they kept doing that, then there would be a very hard, merciless spanking to teach them not to do that because that's inappropriate. I remember another time there was a relative, as the same kid, like this kid like got out of the shower when they were like 3 or 4 years old, and older brother was playing video games, and this like younger relative, like 3 or 4 years old, he jumped my brother's back and was like doing like a horsey ride while he was naked. So you got like this 4 or 5 year old kid laughing while he's naked, putting his body on a teenager, and the exact same thing. Like I remember like this relative's parents like kind of finding it cute and funny, really, when actually, it's just not a good look, really. It's the exact same thing as I said, really. Imagine if I had an older sister and there was a 5 or 4 year old relative that was naked, male, and going on her body, really. What do you think the reaction will be? Totally different than a boy doing that to another boy. Or, what would happen if it was a little girl doing that to an older brother or older sister? Obviously you'd pull the girl off and be like, hey, don't do that. That's inappropriate, really. So it's always funny, like how if it's a boy doing that to a boy, sometimes we overlook that stuff. But still, again, you pull the kid off, you talk to them and say, hey, you don't do this. You're not wearing any clothes. Touching people when you have no clothes on is extremely inappropriate. That's strike one. Strike two is you get a big old spanking, because we have to teach you not to do that. This may be a little hard, but I remember one time I went to Provincetown with my family in high school, and my younger brother, he was always trying to hold my hand, really. And it was something where I was like, it was 2006, I believe, so I was I was born in 87, so I was like 19 years old. And my younger brother was born in 1999, really, so this is a kid that has to be, roughly around, 7 or 8 years old, really. So each time, he would always be like trying to like grab my hand, hold my hand, and I didn't like that, really, because the thing was that I remember like a bunch of like gay couples like looking at us with grins and seductive looks, like, yes, these boys are holding hands, they're trying to be like a gay couple like us. Maybe that's what they're thinking, maybe not, really. But I kind of got looks of like kind of like seductives and grins, like, yes, oh, well, maybe we're kind of like we're trying to like, there's like a conversion therapy thing, really. But that's how I felt. But I don't think that's completely true, really. But it made me feel uncomfortable, and that's also another thing that changed in generations, really. Because I remember when I was a kid, if I ever fell asleep in the car and my head went on my other brother's head, my brother was 2.5 years older. So if I was like 8 years old and my head was going on my other brother's head, my dad would just go back, wake me up, or slap me on in the face and be like, "Hey, don't lean on your brother. That looks gay. That looks weird." Or he's not your husband, really. I remember like one time, I was always close with my brother because we went through a lot of traumatic things together. We really, really rough lives. I remember like one time in middle school, I said, "Hey, my brother's my soulmate," and my dad was like, "No, because he's trying to embarrass us, say, hey, there's boundaries, really." But then when my brother's like when my younger brother, who's like 12 or 13 years younger than me, is trying to hold my hand in Provincetown, that's another example of saying, hey, what, I got to come in as a father and be like, hey, you don't hold your brother's hand, really. Because what, you're 7 years old, really. That's a little too old for something like that. That's just that just looks out of place, really. Because usually when you're a little kid, maybe just to stay together, that works. But there's a certain time when that's not okay, really. I also remember like one time, my little brother was at like a restaurant, and he was about to like hug like one of my dad's friends. My dad just held him back, really, and that was kind of like an example of my dad doing the right thing by saying, hey, you know what, you're getting a little too old to just be like running up and hugging people. I also remember like another time, when I was a kid, we went to Quebec City, and I remember like my dad had a bunch of friends, really, and they had like a daughter, and I ran up and gave her a hug, really, and my dad pulled me off and said, hey, you don't do that, because you just don't do that to people that you don't know, really. So it's always important to teach our children boundaries. And sometimes, you do have children that are very affectionate, and you have to teach them boundaries at a young age. Because I also remember, like with my younger brother too, that there's been times when he's wanted to kiss me on the mouth, or other things like that. And it's like, there's a certain point where, a kid is like very, very little, they don't get it. They don't get why you don't do those things. And then there's a certain age where you have to say, okay, we have to stop that because it just looks weird. Because you go out in public and you see like, a 6, 7, 8 year old kissing a high schooler, that looks weird really. Or I used to run track in high school. So, if my brother wanted to kiss me on the mouth and he's like 7 or 8 years old and I'm running track and there's hundreds of families and they look at that, they're going to be like, okay, maybe we got to call Child Protective Services. Is there a Lolita or aristocrat thing going on? So it's important to teach your kids boundaries. And then also, the other thing that I will throw in here is that I do not like couples and families who kiss their children on the lips. That's just weird. Because, I know not everything's meant to be sexual, but that's just inappropriate in my mind. And I did see that growing up where some people would kiss their son, where fathers would kiss their sons on the lips. No. Fathers kissing their daughters on the lips. No. Mothers kissing their daughters or sons on the lips. No. I do not believe in that. Like, when I grew up, I did kiss people on the cheek because that was kind of like the family thing, really. But I remember like 1 or 2 times that I kissed my grandmother on the lips, but because she wanted me to do that, and not forced, it was just like a custom thing. But you don't. I'm happy that that's kind of going away, really, because to me that's just inappropriate and whatever, really. So I think the whole thing that I'm trying to say with all of this is that yes, generations have changed, but boundaries are always really important, really. And I'm happy that we've kind of understand that there's some things you don't do, really. I remember watching a film called last summer, and there was a girl talking about like how whenever her mother had dinner guests, she would walk over to all dinner guests, kiss them on the cheek, really, kiss them goodnight, because that's considered polite. Or sometimes when kids were young, especially daughters, if there's house guests, they'd be sitting on the laps of everybody because that's considered, a bond, really. When nowadays we kind of know that that's a little inappropriate. That's almost like when you watch that Shirley Temple movie where she's singing and you see a bunch of guys putting their hands on her chest and her shoulders. It's not these people trying to hold her up from falling off a chair. It's just kind of like creepy and weird, really. But there are times too when we have children, and even if we're like trying to be a little bit more like understanding and patient, there are times when we have to teach our children boundaries. If you have any child bouncing up and down on another child, that's not good. When they're trying to kiss other children on the lips or other siblings, that's not good. When they're trying to hold hands of siblings at maybe at an older age, that's not good. When you have kids who are maybe a little hypersexual, and they're doing things like running around naked and other things like that, that's not good, and you gotta have conversations with them. So I do hope that this all helps out a lot, really. And I think that it helps me feel better, because I remember sometimes I've had a younger relative do that exact same thing, like bouncing up and down me and me pushing them off and like, hey, what the hell is this? And then people are like, oh well, you need to just be patient. No, like I said before, and I'll say it again, if I was a girl and I had a younger brother, or I had another cousin or whatever, while I was laying on my back or sleeping on my back, and they were bouncing up and down on me, or just thrusting back and forth on me to do a horsey ride or whatever, what do you think the response would be when they get pulled off? They'll probably get a spanking and understand that you may have thought that wasn't okay. You may have saw it as a horsey ride or whatever. It's not appropriate, really. So it's important to teach our kids boundaries. And it's also important to understand that, anytime you kind of let go of any type of behavior that may be construed as inappropriate or sexually inappropriate, you may be like, oh, they may not get it, or they may saw it in a different light. it's not good because what does that teach the other person who's receiving all that? That it doesn't matter when things happen to them, and that's never a good thing.